December 18, 1975, Amityville, Long Island, New York. When we first saw the house at 112 Ocean Avenue, it felt like a dream come true. The Dutch colonial, with its quaint gabled roof and classic New England charm, was everything we'd ever wanted. The price was almost too good to be true. $80,000 for a property this size, with a boathouse, swimming pool, and 3 stories of space. I should have questioned it, but at the time, all I could think of was how perfect it would be for us. Kathy and I had recently married, blending our families together, and the house was exactly what we needed to start fresh. The realtor mentioned the house's dark history in passing, as if it were just another detail. A year ago, Ronald DeFeo Jr. killed his parents and 4 siblings here, she said, her voice flat and businesslike. He claimed he heard voices telling him to do it. It's all very tragic, of course, but the house has been cleansed, and it's ready for a new family. A shiver ran down my spine, but I quickly brushed it aside. Kathy and I discussed it briefly, but we both decided it was the perfect house for us, and what had happened there in the past was just that, past. It wouldn't affect us, or so we thought. We moved in on December 18th, just in time to get settled before Christmas. The air was crisp, the sky a dull, leaden gray, typical of Long Island in winter. The house loomed over us as we unpacked, its windows like blank eyes staring out over the lawn. Inside, the space was cold, despite the furnace roaring to life in the basement. We lit a fire in the hearth, hoping to bring some warmth into the house, but the flames seemed to struggle against the chill. The first few days were uneventful, filled with the usual chaos of moving. We unpacked, arranged furniture, and tried to make the place feel like home. The kids, Danny, Chris, and Missy, ran through the empty rooms, their laughter echoing off the walls. They seemed to love the house as much as we did, although Danny, our eldest, seemed a bit withdrawn. He was a quiet kid, always lost in his thoughts. But something about his silence in this house felt different. The strangeness began on the 4th night. I woke up at exactly 3:15 a.m., drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The house was silent, the kind of silence that presses in on you, heavy and oppressive. I sat up in bed listening, but there was nothing. No wind, no creaking floorboards, just an eerie stillness. I glanced at the clock, noting the time, and tried to shake off the unease that had settled over me. I convinced myself it was just a bad dream and lay back down, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, Kathy mentioned that she'd woken up around the same time, feeling strange, almost as if she were being watched. I didn't tell her about my own experience, not wanting to alarm her, but a knot of dread tightened in my stomach. The following nights were worse. Every night at 3:15 a.m., I'd wake up, sweating and panicked, as if something had pulled me from sleep. And every night, the house seemed to grow colder, the air thick with an unspoken menace. The walls, which had once seemed warm and inviting, now felt like they were closing in on us. Kathy began to change too. She became more irritable, her usual warmth replaced by a sharp edge. The kids started fighting more, and Danny's silence grew more pronounced. I caught him staring at the walls, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. When I asked him what was wrong, he just shook his head, refusing to speak. One night, as I sat in the living room trying to read, I heard a noise coming from the kitchen. It was a faint, rhythmic thumping, like the sound of someone pounding on the floor. I put down my book and listened, my heart racing. The sound continued, steady and relentless. I got up and walked to the kitchen, the floorboards creaking under my feet. The kitchen was dark, the only light coming from the moon outside, casting long shadows across the floor. The thumping grew louder as I approached, and I could feel the vibration through the soles of my feet. My breath hitched in my throat as I reached the center of the room, where the sound was strongest. I stood there staring at the floor, trying to make sense of it. Suddenly, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and I felt a rush of cold air wash over me, raising goosebumps on my arms. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. I finally forced myself to move, backing out of the kitchen, my heart hammering in my chest. I told Kathy about it the next day, but she dismissed it as the house settling, or maybe a raccoon in the walls. I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. There was a darkness in this house, something malevolent that seemed to be growing stronger with each passing day. Then the shadows started appearing. At first I thought it was just my imagination, tricks of the light, but soon it became impossible to ignore. They were dark, shapeless figures that would flit across the room out of the corner of my eye, disappearing the moment I turned to look at them directly. They seemed to gather in the corners, lurking just beyond the reach of the light, watching us. Missy, our youngest, began talking to an imaginary friend she called Jody. At first we didn't think much of it. Lots of kids have imaginary friends. But there was something unsettling about the way she talked about Jody. She described her as a large, pig-like creature with glowing red eyes. The first time she told me, I laughed it off, but the seriousness in her voice sent a chill down my spine. One evening, as Kathy and I were getting ready for bed, Missy came into our room, her eyes wide with fear. "Jody says she wants to come inside," she whispered, her voice trembling. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. "Inside where?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Inside me," Missy said, her voice barely audible. "She says she wants to be part of me." Kathy gasped, pulling Missy into her arms. "It's just a dream, sweetheart," she said, but her voice shook with fear. "Jody isn't real." But Missy's face was deadly serious. "She is real, Mommy, and she's angry." That night, the house felt more oppressive than ever. The air was thick with an almost tangible sense of dread, as if the walls themselves were alive, pulsating with malevolent energy. The shadows seemed darker, more defined, and the temperature dropped so low we could see our breath in the air. I felt like we were being watched, every movement scrutinized by unseen eyes. As I lay in bed, unable to sleep, the sound of thumping returned, louder this time, echoing through the house. It was coming from below, from the basement. My heart raced as I threw off the covers and crept down the stairs, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. The basement door stood ajar, the darkness beyond it impenetrable. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but something compelled me forward. I stepped through the doorway, the wooden stairs creaking beneath my weight as I descended into the blackness. The air in the basement was thick, suffocating, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. The thumping grew louder, coming from the far corner of the room, where the shadows were darkest. I forced myself to move closer, my heart pounding in my ears, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. As I reached the corner, the thumping stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that sent a bolt of terror through me. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed, as a figure emerged from the shadows, a hulking, misshapen form with glowing red eyes that burned with malevolent intelligence. I stumbled back, my foot catching on the edge of the staircase. I scrambled up the stairs, my hands slipping on the cold, damp wood. The growl followed me, growing louder, more insistent, as I reached the top and slammed the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, my chest heaving, my body shaking with fear. But the door did little to keep the terror at bay. The sound of scratching began, slow at first, then frantic, as if something was trying to claw its way out of the basement. The walls around me seemed to pulse with a life of their own, the shadows twisting and writhing, reaching out for me. I knew then that we had to leave. The house was alive, its very essence corrupted by the evil that had taken root within its walls. Whatever had driven Ronald DeFeo to commit those unspeakable acts was still here, lurking in the darkness, waiting to claim us as its next victims. But leaving wasn't going to be easy. The house had its claws in us, and it wasn't going to let go without a fight. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, something happened that shattered any hope I had left. A discovery that would mark the beginning of our descent into a nightmare from which there would be no escape. The discovery was so subtle at first that I almost missed it. In the early hours of December 23rd, after another sleepless night, I decided to take a closer look at the basement. Something in me, a deep, gnawing curiosity, or maybe a desperate need to understand, pushed me to face whatever it was that had been haunting us. I went down there alone, armed with nothing more than a flashlight. The air was thick with that same foul odor of decay, but now there was something else. A metallic tang that stuck to the back of my throat, making me gag. I aimed the beam of light around the room, my hands shaking, the shadows seeming to dance in response to the trembling light. Then I saw it, a small, hidden door in the far corner of the basement, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. The door was old, its wood splintered and warped, and something about it filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. I hadn't seen it before, though I had been in the basement many times. It was as if it had simply appeared, summoned by the dark force that permeated the house. I hesitated, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn back. But something stronger compelled me to reach out and grasp the cold, rusted handle. It creaked open with a slow, agonizing groan, and a wave of cold air blasted out, carrying with it a stench so vile it nearly knocked me off my feet. Inside, the space was small, barely more than a crawl space. The walls were lined with strange markings, symbols that looked ancient, carved deep into the stone. But what drew my attention was the pool of black liquid at the center, thick and bubbling like tar. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen, its surface shifting and churning, as though something beneath it was alive. I backed away, terror clawing at my throat, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from that inky blackness. It seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a malevolent energy that radiated from it, filling the room with a dark, oppressive presence. And then, as I stood frozen in the doorway, something rose from the pool. A figure, its form barely distinguishable in the shadows, but its eyes, those glowing red eyes, pierced through the darkness, locking onto mine. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut, but I knew it was too late. Whatever I had disturbed, whatever evil had been lying dormant, was now fully awake. I fled the basement, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with fear. That night, the house came alive in a way I had never experienced before. The walls vibrated with a low hum, a frequency that seemed to crawl into my bones, making them ache. The air was so thick with malice, or it was almost suffocating, and the temperature plummeted, frosting the windows and turning our breath into clouds of white mist. I tried to tell Kathy, but she was in a strange state, almost trance-like. Her eyes glazed over, and her responses slow, as if she were struggling to stay awake. The kids, too, were affected. Danny's silence had turned into a brooding darkness, and Chris and Missy cried constantly, complaining of nightmares and voices that wouldn't stop whispering to them. And then came the night of December 24th, Christmas Eve. It was supposed to be a night of joy, of warmth and family, but the house had other plans. As we gathered around the fireplace, trying to keep some semblance of normalcy, the shadows in the room began to move, coalescing into shapes that were almost human. I watched in horror as one of them broke away from the others and started to approach us, its form growing more solid, more real with each step. The children screamed, and Kathy pulled them close, but there was no escaping it. The shadow reached out, its hand, or what I could only assume was a hand, hovering just inches from Kathy's face. She gasped, her body convulsing, as if something had reached inside her, pulling at her very soul. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and for a moment, I thought I'd lost her. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The shadow withdrew, retreating back into the darkness, and Kathy collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. Her skin was pale, her lips blue, as if she had been on the verge of death. That was when I knew we had to leave, no matter what. This house wasn't just haunted. It was evil, and it was trying to consume us, body and soul. But leaving wasn't going to be easy. The house had its claws in us, and it wasn't going to let go without a fight. We packed our bags that night, throwing whatever we could into suitcases, desperate to get out before anything else could happen. But the house wasn't done with us yet. As I went to grab the last of our things from the master bedroom, the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. The temperature dropped even further, my breath coming out in thick white clouds as I pounded on the door, screaming for help. The walls began to close in, the shadows pressing against me, suffocating me with their weight. I could hear them whispering, their voices low and guttural, speaking in a language I couldn't understand but felt in my bones. They were telling me to give in, to let go, that there was no escape. I fought against it, struggling to keep my sanity as the darkness closed in. But then, just when I thought I would lose myself to the madness, the door burst open, and Kathy was there, pulling me out, her face a mask of terror. "We need to go now," she screamed, and I didn't argue. We grabbed the kids, who were pale and trembling, and bolted for the front door. But as we stepped outside, I could feel the house watching us, its malevolent presence lingering in the air, as if it were waiting, knowing that this wasn't over. We drove away, our tires spinning on the icy road as we sped into the night. But even as we left that cursed place behind, the terror followed us. The shadows still haunted my dreams. The whispers still echoed in my mind, and the cold, oppressive dread that had filled that house clung to us, like a dark cloud that we couldn't shake. We stayed with friends for a few days, trying to regroup, trying to figure out what to do next. But it was clear that we couldn't go back. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue had claimed too many lives, and it wasn't about to stop. We had barely escaped with ours. On December 28th, we officially left Amityville for good, abandoning everything we had worked for. The house stood there, silent and still, as if waiting for its next victims. But I knew deep down that it would never rest, never be satisfied. Whatever dark force inhabited that place, it was ancient, malevolent, and hungry. The Lutz family survived the horrors of 112 Ocean Avenue, but we were never the same. The house had left its mark on us, a scar that would never fully heal. We moved far away, trying to rebuild our lives, but the memory of that place, of those terrible nights, would haunt us forever. And as the years passed, the story of the Amityville house would become legend, a tale of horror passed down from generation to generation. But I knew the truth. I had lived it, and I knew that somewhere in the darkness, the house was still waiting for the next family to move in, waiting for its next victims, waiting to feed.